Dark stone corridors echo with footsteps. A torch sputters. Somewhere in the depths of a fortress, a door groans open, not into a battlefield, but into a chamber of judgment. This is not a place for swords and shields. This is a war fought on the human body itself, a war waged in the name of faith, morality, and order. The Middle Ages are remembered for knights and castles, banners fluttering in the wind, and kingdoms rising and falling. But there was another battle being fought, one without armies or armor. It was a campaign to control desire, to discipline flesh, and to crush the human spirit where it was most vulnerable. This was not simply punishment for crimes. It was punishment for temptation, for stepping outside the rigid rules of medieval morality. The Church did not merely guide the soul. In many places and periods, it policed the body. And when words and sermons failed, public rituals of shame and physical torment stepped in. For rulers and priests alike, the human body was both battlefield and trophy, a place where power could be written in blood, ink, and scar. Let's journey into a world where religion was law, where sin could be hunted like heresy, and where punishments for the flesh were meant to save the soul, or so they claimed. To understand this brutal campaign, we have to start with the way medieval Europe viewed the body. Desire was dangerous. Passion was not a private matter but a threat to society and God's order. The flesh was seen as weak, corrupt, and in need of discipline. The stricter the discipline, the more virtuous it seemed. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the perils of lust. Writers warned that sin began in the senses. Eyes lingering too long, hands wandering, mouth speaking forbidden words. If the body tempted the soul, then surely the body had to be controlled, even punished. This thinking gave rise to laws and decrees aimed at stamping out immorality. Adulterers could be paraded naked through the streets. Fornication, simply sleeping with someone outside of marriage, could mean fines, whipping, or imprisonment. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of this crusade. Their bodies were considered both dangerous and in need of strict supervision. It wasn't just about individual sin. Authorities feared that unbridled desire could tear apart the social fabric. If the flesh could not be ruled, how could the kingdom or the church be ruled? In medieval Europe, punishment was rarely hidden away. Justice was a spectacle. Town squares became open-air courts and execution grounds. Crowds gathered to watch not just executions but humiliations. Stocks and pillories, those wooden frames that locked offenders by the neck and wrists, were not just about holding someone still. They turned people into living statues of disgrace. Passers-by could jeer, spit, or throw rotten food. If the offense involved lust or adultery, the condemned might be forced to wear signs detailing their sin. A man accused of seducing a neighbor's wife might be paraded with a mock phallus hung around his neck. A woman accused of immodesty could be shorn of her hair, stripping her of dignity in front of her peers. Clothing, or the lack of it, was a weapon of shame. Stripping someone bare in public turned punishment into a kind of sermon. It sent a message. The body you used for sin is now the body we use for judgment. Church courts often claimed to be saving souls through discipline. A whipping could be justified as an act of mercy, a way to purge sin before the last judgment. Monks and priests themselves sometimes submitted to self-flagellation, beating their own backs with cords or rods, as a way to resist temptation. If holy men punished their own flesh, how much more should common sinners submit? But beneath the theology was something darker. These punishments also reinforced social hierarchies. The wealthy often escaped with fines. The poor, especially women, were far more likely to face public humiliation. Even minor infractions, like gossip, flirting, or wearing immodest clothes, could trigger harsh penalties in some towns. In many cases, authorities blurred the line between moral correction and raw intimidation. Punishing the body became a way to prove that power came from above, and that no one, man or woman, could defy it without consequences. While many punishments were symbolic or theatrical, some were designed to inflict real, lasting pain. Instruments were created not just to restrain but to degrade. The infamous chastity belt, though often exaggerated in legend, reflects a genuine fear of uncontrolled desire. In reality, most so-called chastity belts were ceremonial, a warning rather than a practical device. But other devices, like the shrew's fiddle or neck violin, were very real. This iron collar locked around a woman's neck and wrists, forcing her arms forward in a position of helplessness. Used on women accused of scolding or being sexually unruly, it was part restraint, part stage prop, turning living people into living lessons. Then there was the scold's bridle, a cruel iron mask with a tongue plate that pressed down on the mouth. Officially used to punish gossip or heresy, it was also inflicted on women accused of sexual looseness. The device silenced its victims, literally, while parading them through the streets. The purpose was always twofold, to hurt and to humiliate, and humiliation was often more lasting than the pain itself. As Europe moved into the later Middle Ages and early modern period, fear of the body merged with fear of witchcraft. The female body, in particular, became a focus of suspicion. Witch hunters accused women of consorting with demons, seducing men, or using sexuality as a weapon against Christian society. Interrogations could turn brutal. While some of the most infamous accounts of torture come from the 16th and 17th centuries, their roots lie in medieval attitudes toward sin and flesh. The idea was simple. If desire was dangerous, and women were believed to be its agents, then controlling them was a holy duty. Women were stripped, shaved, and searched for devil's marks. Any natural blemish could be called evidence of a pact with darkness. While such rituals were framed as investigations, they were really performances of dominance. Religion and law working hand in hand to show that no part of a woman's body was beyond scrutiny. Men, of course, also faced punishment for lust and sexual misconduct. But the scales were rarely balanced. A nobleman's indiscretion might be settled quietly with money or favor. A peasant woman's indiscretion could end in a flogging, a shorn head, or a march through town in chains. This double standard reveals the deeper purpose of these punishments. They weren't just about sin, they were about power. They reinforced who could act without consequence, and who must live in fear. Even when men were punished, the rituals often targeted their masculinity. Being stripped naked, shaved, or made to wear mocking costumes undermined their honor. For medieval society, public shame was worse than physical pain. Wounds healed, but disgrace could linger for a lifetime. In all these practices, whether it was the pillory in the market square, the iron bridle clamped on a woman's head, or the whispered threat of the inquisitor's chamber, we see a pattern. Medieval Europe feared not only crime but chaos. It feared passion, the unpredictable force of human desire. Religion gave that fear a holy language, and rulers gave it teeth. When you look at these punishments, you see a society trying to write order onto human flesh, trying to carve obedience into the very skin of its people. And though the centuries have passed, the echoes remain. Whenever fear of the body becomes fear of freedom, the war on flesh begins again. But shame is a resource that rulers and priests never depleted. If fear was the sword, then humiliation was the rope that bound communities to obedience. Take, for example, the infamous bridle of silence. In small towns across England and Scotland, women accused of scolding, gossiping, or spreading lewd talk were marched into public squares. A cold iron cage, fitted with a tongue press, clamped their mouths shut. The so-called scold's bridle was less about stopping words and more about displaying control. These women became living warnings, their bodies transformed into sermons on obedience. The crowd didn't just watch. They learned what happens when a person, especially a woman, refused to conform. Yet the church's hand extended far beyond gossip and neighborhood feuds. Its punishments for sins of the flesh were designed not only to correct but to annihilate personal dignity. Monks and nuns accused of breaking vows of chastity were sometimes stripped, flogged, or forced to crawl through cloisters wearing signs declaring their crimes. What mattered most wasn't the pain inflicted. It was the message. The body must bow to the soul, and the soul must bow to the church. Inquisition records from Spain and Italy reveal that officials were less interested in whether people truly sinned than whether they appeared repentant in front of their neighbors. Public penance became theater. A wrongdoer, real or imagined, was dressed in a humiliating garment, the San Benito, painted with images of fire and demons. Some paraded barefoot through cities, holding candles, while priests shouted their offenses. Even rumors of immorality could condemn you, and when the whispers turned to accusations of heresy or witchcraft, punishments deepened into something darker. Consider the witch hunts that swept through Europe. Although many imagine bonfires and midnight trials, the truth is far more bureaucratic and far more humiliating. Before women were burned, drowned, or hanged, they were often subjected to invasive searches for the devil's mark. Entire towns would gather as midwives or hired witch prickers examined every inch of a suspect's body for unusual scars or blemishes. A raised mole or patch of discolored skin could be declared evidence of a pact with Satan. This wasn't just cruelty. It was control over both flesh and reputation. The cruel irony? These searches often turned into spectacles. Crowds jeered as accused women stood naked or half-clothed, trembling in the cold. The trials were not only about rooting out evil but enforcing an order where female bodies were objects to be inspected, judged, and disciplined by men in power. Religion, dressed as justice, wielded humiliation as its sharpest tool. But men too were not spared. Medieval Europe saw punishments that targeted male sexuality with equal precision. Adulterers might be paraded through the streets with their clothes inside out, or forced to wear horns as a symbol of their betrayal. In some cases, priests ordered men to confess their unclean desires in public, as neighbors listened and gossiped. To admit temptation aloud was to place one's soul and reputation into the hands of the crowd. The shame was crushing, and that was precisely the point. What's striking is how these practices traveled beyond church courts and into secular law. Kings, dukes, and city magistrates realized that nothing subdued a population more efficiently than public embarrassment. Stocks, pillories, and whipping posts were placed in the busiest market squares. Imagine trying to sell bread while a man is chained beside you, wearing a sign that says, "Fornicator" or "Lecher." The punishment was as much about what the neighbors saw as what the criminal felt. These rituals of control blurred the lines between faith and governance. A bishop could punish a sinner's flesh, but so could a mayor. Both claimed divine approval. Both claimed to be saving the soul by disciplining the body. And the public? They rarely questioned the spectacle. In a world where famine, disease, and death were constant companions, seeing someone else fall under the lash was almost comforting. It proved that someone was in charge. It reassured people that sin was being cleansed, that God's order was intact. Shame wasn't only a tool of rulers, it was a social glue. Yet cracks appeared in this system. Some people resisted. Chronicles tell of townsfolk secretly feeding bread and water to punished women wearing bridles. Others whispered that priests who preached purity in daylight violated it at night. When punishment becomes too harsh, too obviously hypocritical, it loses its power. And by the late Middle Ages, this was happening everywhere. Take the case of Marjorie Baxter, a woman in 15th century Norwich accused of heresy and sexual sin. Forced to stand barefoot in the marketplace, she was mocked as priests denounced her. But instead of shame, Marjorie spoke back. "You punish my body," she said, "but not my soul." Her defiance sparked murmurs among the crowd. It showed that public humiliation could backfire, turning a victim into a kind of hero. Over time, the Reformation and the rise of new political powers weakened the Church's monopoly on punishment. But the logic of control, the war on the body, did not vanish. It shifted into new forms. Civil courts replaced ecclesiastical tribunals. Secular rulers continued to use shame, now draped in the language of law instead of theology. Even when torture devices disappeared from monasteries, they reappeared in dungeons of kings and inquisitors alike. The lesson is unsettling. Tools of control never truly die. They are reinvented. The medieval war on the body was never just about pain. Pain ends. Shame lingers. A scar might fade from the skin, but disgrace follows a name for generations. By parading sinners, branding heretics, and humiliating accused witches, both church and state inscribed their authority directly onto human flesh. And beneath all this, the bridles, the pillories, the whips, lay a simple message. Your body does not belong to you. It belongs to us, and through it we own your soul. This is why these punishments feel so alien to us today, yet also strangely familiar. Modern societies may not force adulterers to wear horns, but the hunger to shame, to display guilt publicly, has never truly left us. Social media scandals echo the pillory. Cancel culture mirrors the crowd in the market square. We no longer march wrongdoers in iron cages, but reputations can still be broken overnight. Looking back at the Middle Ages, it's easy to dismiss these punishments as barbaric superstition. But history challenges us to look deeper. They were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, organized systems meant to control bodies, regulate desire, and enforce obedience, especially in matters of sexuality. The war on the body wasn't fought only with swords and chains. It was fought with sermons, rituals, and the watchful eyes of neighbors. It was fought in the cold marketplaces of Europe, where ordinary people learned that salvation came not only from God, but from proving publicly that you were obedient. And so we are left with a question. When authority claims the right to discipline flesh, how much of our humanity are we willing to surrender before we begin to fight back?